Let's try this one more time. Welcome to Austin Estuary Park and Donkey Creek. I am Rachel Easton, the Education Director for Harbor Wild Watch, bringing you this weekly peek into the creek. We're looking to see if we see any fish activity or any other activity. Who really knows what we're gonna find here? But I am standing right at the mouth of Donkey Creek, which is where the fresh water mixes with the salt water in this great estuary habitat. Let me flip it around so you can see what a gorgeous spot it is this morning. We've got a little bit of stillness to the weather and the water here. And look at that, reflections of blue sky. Not something I expect to find on a November morning, to be sure. Before we really get going looking for creatures, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is Spoyalapapsh, traditional lands, better known as the Puyallup tribe of Indians. And they have been stewards of this place since the beginning and continue to be an important factor in the restoration of this place as well. If you haven't visited recently, there's been a couple of changes to the park. Of course, it's a park that is in a state of restoration. So it is trying to be kind of more rewilded. And so we have a lot of native plants that are here, as well as, you know, it's not gonna be landscape. There's no playgrounds. There's no irrigation or anything here. This is trying to return to what it would have been like several hundred years ago. But there is great new information, or not new information, but new installations here about the Puyallup tribe. And I encourage everyone to come down and visit. There is also a really great, I'm not gonna walk over to it, but I'll point it out to you so you know where to come when you come visit. But if you look right over there, there is this beautiful green speaker box there that will teach you the Puyallup or the Lachute seed pronunciation for a lot of the words that are used in this place. So it's a really, really great new installation. We're thankful to the city of Gig Harbor for installing those, as well as the Puyallup tribe of Indians for working together to bring this information here. So this is a great time of year to spend time in and around the estuary because we get birds that are flying south for the winter, and this is their south. So these are animals that are migrating down here to the more temperate areas, away from like the higher, more northern latitudes where it's getting really cold up there in Canada. And so these shorebirds will come here and overwinter here. So I believe these are widgeons, but I am not up on my shorebird identification. They say all you have to really do is memorize the spots of white and where they're located, and that will give you a good clue as to what birds you are looking at, because they each have a little bit different pattern on them. But we get to see the usual suspects, the mallards. In fact, I see a male mallard way at the back there along the shore. And then we get these great seasonal visitors as well. And on a nice calm day like this, I would expect to find lots and lots of animal activity here in the estuary. And when we get a lot of animals congregating in one spot and we have lots of diversity, it's a really good sign for the health of the environment. Especially when it comes to these birds. Birds are really mobile, and if an environment doesn't have what they need, they'll just leave. Oh, look, there's some buffleheads. Okay, so here's one that I do know. Look at all the white on these friends. The males have that really, really bright white patch behind their head, and the females are slightly more drab because they're gonna be literally sitting ducks on a nest at some point in the future, hopefully, and they don't want to draw attention to them. Whereas the males need to attract the attention of all the females in the area in order to maximize their reproductive potential, and so they are quite a bit more showy. Very cool to see these animals here. Oh, and look, just right up there is a cormorant, I believe, a double-crested cormorant, and a diving bird. One that's here year-round, My favorite place to view them is out at the Purdy Spit. Over on the private side of the spit, there are some pilings, and the cormorants like to dry themselves there. They're one of the only aquatic birds that has no oil in their feathers. So these gulls over here and the ducks all have this waterproof oil that they secrete out of their glands, and they use their beak to rub it around and spread it on their bodies. So you'll see, if you watch ducks for any length of time, you'll see them preening like this one's doing right here, scratching an itch with their foot, moving that oil around to try to waterproof their feathers and keep them buoyant in the water. But for the cormorant, you can see that bird's much lower in the water. Barely see it, they're black. The cormorant needs to be able to dive down, and that buoyancy would affect them. That would trap too much air in their feathers and make it so they can't reach the bottom where they're going to be foraging for fish. And so the cormorant needs to dry off. They're warm-blooded, just like you and I are. And so when they get cold and chilled like this, after a morning of fishing for their breakfast, they will find a perch and spend some time drying out. And it always looks like they're kind of telling fishing stories because they have their wings all the way spread out. Seeing if I can get a little closer to these birds to show you some of their details, because they're just really beautiful. This is a much smaller duck than our mallards, probably about half the size. And then over here, we have a different species. And a lot of these shorebirds will spend time, oh, you can see the two mallards up at the top, male and female. And then we've got, I believe these are widgeons. And another bufflehead over there. So birds like this will spend time in the estuary. A lot of the time they are grooming and preening themselves in the fresh water that's flowing out. And right here, it gets a little confusing because there is a storm drain that is moving quite a bit of water out. And then there is the natural outflow of the creek. And so both of those are bringing fresh water straight from the land. And then the birds will kind of groom. And if we look at our seagulls, that is exactly what they're doing. So when you see them flapping and kind of kicking about, splashing a bit, that is them grooming themselves. And they like it here because there's a nice layer of fresh water that flows from the creek. So it's a perfect spot for a little bath. It's also a good spot to forage. And I'm surprised I haven't seen any harbor seals in this area yet. They come in when the salmon do because it's an easy lunch. And then quite often we get some large predatory birds in the area as well. So things like eagles and osprey that are going to be hunting some of these shorebirds as well. If we walk and kind of look up on the hillsides, we can see there's not very many of those leaves, especially on the big leaf maples. They're pretty much all done. And that's going to change the characteristic of our creek a little bit and is a sure sign of the season changing. So let's go walk along a little bit. We're again walking through Austin Estuary Park here. And it is a park that is in restoration. Sorry, let me zoom out so you don't have to get so dizzy. It's a park in restoration, so you see these kind of scraggly looking plants. You're thinking, man, why wouldn't they landscape this? Could be really beautiful. Well, it is really beautiful, just not right now. November is kind of a dull time for a lot of the plant life in our area. And this place was the site of a major restoration in 2013, and native plants were planted. So this is snowberry, which is kind of a really cool native plant. We also can see, like, oh yeah, you can see these rose hips. These are wild roses. And this is the fruit of a rose. Kind of cool to see. They're very, very high in vitamin C. So if you're feeling like you're getting some scurvy, maybe have a nibble of that. Just kidding. Don't eat plants you find in a park. It's not a great plan, even if they are edible. So this is the mouth of the creek where the fresh water is opening out, making this area an estuary. And just look how beautiful it is today. Just gorgeous. Now it is kind of a medium tide. The tide is going out right now. which is not as favorable for our salmon. Here is some more of those great signage. These big cement pilings that the signage is on were part of a trestle bridge that was installed across the creek in the 1800s. And when the creek was filled in and routed through a culvert, they were just kind of tossed in the infill. Here we've got a nice gull. This one's a juvenile, foraging in the creek, no doubt, for some eggs that may be washing out. I can tell that it's a juvenile because it's kind of grayish and mottled colored. When it's an adult, it will be mostly white and gray. Here is kind of an interesting thing we get some questions on. What in the world is that contraption? Well, this is a storm drain outflow. So water that falls on the surrounding landscape is going to flow through storm drains, and then it goes unfiltered straight out into the bay, or right here out into the creek. And this is a really clever solution to try to stop some of the erosion that happens when we get tons of rain flowing all at once. So you can see the water's going to flow down. It's going to hit this T kind of structure, which is filled with holes, so that the water can then come out. And when it's actively raining, like it was during our atmospheric river last week, this really looks more like a fountain than a drain. So right here, we can see the level of the creek is going down quite a bit because the tide is retreating. So we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day here in the Pacific Northwest, which means the tide is almost always moving and changing. And if you spend any time watching the bay, or even just driving along, just look out and pay attention to what the tide is doing. It's a really great way to kind of establish and feel the rhythm of the place, because it's always changing. So we can look where I'm standing here and see that on a high tide, this is going to be underwater. So sometimes these rocks are a little new, so they probably don't have any barnacles yet, but down here we can see these barnacles are right in the middle of the creek. They're in the fresh water right now, but barnacles are a saltwater species, which tells us that the tide, when it comes up, reaches this level and brings with it those larval barnacles which have settled here. And so they basically close up when it's low tide, when the fresh water hits them, or when they are exposed like this. And then when the tide comes back up, it's going to reach pretty far up. And this time of year, we are experiencing our king tides. And so you can kind of see the line where the algae kind of grows. There's kind of a dent in the land here. That is about where the high tide comes up. And so if we look on this side, we can kind of see, where the grass doesn't really like to be inundated with salt water. It can tolerate a little, and my guess is some of this grass has grown in over the summer months and will die back as we go into the winter months when we get more higher tides. Ooh, and I need to be careful not to slip. Okay, and then we have some cool erosion prevention. This is some jute netting that is just here while the plants establish themselves. So it's a great way to prevent erosion. So let's walk along and see if we can see some salmon in the creek. Oh, and look right here, we've got some. So because the tide is on its way out right now, the water level in the creek is dropping, and that makes it more difficult for these fish to swim up. They're only in about 8 to 10 inches of water right now. And so these two are just sort of chilling here, waiting. Speaking of chilling, it's pretty chilly out. Our water temperature is right around 50, 45 degrees, somewhere in there. And that's what these fish want. They want it nice and cold. Salmon require cold, clear streams. And so that's why we have some fish here in this creek. Now this year was kind of interesting because our chum salmon traditionally, for like maybe the past decade or so, come up right around mid-November on this creek. It seems to be a little bit later than other creeks in the area, but this year they were in early. So if you are here and you notice fish in the creek, we do have a community science log. There's a little station underneath the bridge where you can fill out information on how many fish you saw, and that helps us track that information year to year, so we have a better understanding of why and when and how these fish are coming up the creek, because it's fantastic. for us to know. And this is a very urban stream, so you can hear the car noise. It's surrounded on two sides by different roads, and it's very heavily populated here. And yet these fish don't seem to be bothered by it. They just come right back each year. So salmon are what we call anadromous fish. That means they are hatched in freshwater. They transition to salt water through a process called smoltification, and then they spend 3 to 5 years out in the salt water, growing large, basically getting as much mass as they can, so that when they come back upstream, they have the energy to navigate up against the flow of the river to find the right kind of gravel that they need. And so for these fish, they're looking for gravel about the size of a pencil eraser, and it needs to be fully in fresh water. So right here where this fish is, this is not a good spot to spawn. You can see the big rocky cobble and kind of silty sand. It's not what they're going to be looking for. So these fish will use their energy and they'll travel up. This is a short stream, and chum are short spawners, meaning they usually don't go more than about 5 miles from the saltwater. Some species of salmon, though, are going to be navigating thousands of miles upstream. We have sockeye salmon and Chinook salmon, which travel pretty far. But in these little tiny streams that are so common across all of the Salish Sea, this is perfect habitat for chum salmon, which is our second largest species of salmon. And they don't spend very much time in the saltwater at all. So they come up now, maybe kind of now for the next couple of weeks, they'll head up to their spawning grounds. They'll find the right gravel. They'll dig a nest called a red, deposit their eggs, which are immediately fertilized, and then the parents will die. So I expect we'll start to see some, oh yeah, look, here we go. Start to see some carcasses showing up. And a lot of people get kind of nervous when this happens, thinking that the fish are suffering or there's something poisonous or toxic, but this is a part of the natural life cycle of salmon. It's just kind of how it happens. They bring all their nutrients up with them, they spawn, and they leave behind their bodies to enrich the area. Now, obviously, they're probably not doing that intentionally, but it is still a really, really cool, important part of the salmon life cycle, because those carcasses are bringing marine nutrients to a very nutrient poor area. If you think about it, creeks are constantly pulling and leaching nutrients from the ground and carrying them away. They're flowing downstream, and so the rain that falls kind of washes nutrients down into the stream and then away from that habitat. But salmon, bringing them back, can help enrich the area, and which is why, in part, we have some very, very large trees next to the salmon stream. So let's go up and see if we can see from the viewing platform any salmon in the creek. So we'll be doing our first in-person salmon tour tomorrow. Stina will be out here, and I think the weather looks pretty good for that too. So, oh, this is interesting. A tree has fallen over into the creek. Now, most times when a tree falls, we get kind of sad about it, but this is actually a pretty great thing when it happens in salmon streams, because the salmon need a place to rest. So we saw those fish kind of waiting, expending a little bit of energy in the creek, but what they would really love is a place where they can rest, a nice pool. So we've got one fish here, two fish here. The one in front is a female. I can tell that because of the dark bar stripe along her side. The one behind is a male, and I can tell because he's kind of purpley. Got some nice kind of splotches color-wise. And whether they are a pair or not, I'm not sure, but if they are, we'll notice maybe some biting and some jostling with the two of them as they kind of communicate to one another, their readiness to spawn. And again, this is not a great spot for it because the salt water does inundate this far. So these fish will still have a little ways to go before they can make it all the way up to the proper spawning ground. But Sina will be giving a salmon tour tomorrow, so if you want to come and see these fish and have your questions answered, she'll be here, I believe, at 9 o'clock, but check our calendar events on our website or on Facebook. And we'll continue to do these salmon tours for you. Let's go a little farther up and take a look and see if we can see more fish in the creek. Oh, I should mention, there are these great poetry installations here. So I really encourage you to walk along the whole length of the creek that the public can access and take a look at some of that awesome art that is installed. So here's another tree that once upon a time fell across the creek. Didn't quite make it all the way down. But these ones that we see are a very normal and natural part of streams here in the Northwest. They create ripples and pools and wading spaces for our fish. And most of them are not too high. So, you know, even a really, really big log, like if this one were to fall, my goodness, this is a big, big tree. It's still something that the salmon would be able to navigate over or kind of under and around as the flow of the creek changes. I love this cluster of 3. There are 3 Douglas fir trees kind of all growing together, and my son calls them the tree amigos, and I just love that. So here, this is you want to be really careful walking here because it's rather steep, but here's another great place to view the fish where you're a little bit higher up. You're not going to disturb them as much, and usually I hear them before I see them. You'll hear the little splashing as they decide to make jaunt upstream a bit. But I don't see any here. Okay, let's go maybe one more spot up. And like I said, the creek, the tide is going low now, so a lot of fish will wait until the influx of the high tide because it gives them just a much easier path up. Oh, here we go. Some splashing. There's a nice healthy male. Very cool to see and hear. And notice all the leaf litter that is around from these huge big leaf maples that have dropped all of their leaves into the surrounding area. The leaf litter is really kind of important because it does soak up water and it helps prevent some of that erosion. So if you've ever noticed, like during a construction project, when they disturb the ground, they'll, you know, sprinkle some hay or straw out to try to stop that erosion process from happening. Well, that naturally happens here with these big leaf maple leaves, and it happens right at the time when we get the most rain. So as the trees lose their leaves in the fall, it coincides with all the rain that we get here in the Pacific Northwest, and it helps prevent erosion, which is really important for these fish. Now, you might have seen in our recent flooding across the state with the huge amounts of rain that have fallen in the past couple of weeks that the rivers really get churned up and turn brown and silty. The fish can still swim through that, but it's better, much better when it's a clean, clear stream and we don't have that same kind of flooding. All right, friends, well, I'm gonna leave you here with this beautiful image of all of our mossy and beautiful maple trees here. I encourage you to come down to the creek and spend some time looking. Maybe take a look at the tide charts and find out when that high tide is, when the fish would be more likely to be making their way upstream. And we will be continuing to give you coverage of what's happening in our salmon streams. So stay tuned and check back next week. Thanks, everybody. Learn, have fun.